See, I think my screen is sharing now. The name of the title of the class this morning is Structural Impediments to Localization. And when I refer to that name of localization, I'm trying to put a name to this idea, this tendency that good development, good quality community development should mostly be focused on helping people to live well in their place. And in the area of the world that I live in, that's increasingly becoming more difficult because people are migrating, because the government is trying to bring in big corporations. Where I live is a fairly touristy area, and so there's lots of investment now from foreign actors in mega tourist investment. But I think that this place where I live is beautiful and special because of the people that live here. Not because of the people who come from the outside, but because of those that live here, because of the resources that our community has maintained. And so I want to take a look at how this idea of localized, empowering sovereignty, autonomy of local communities, how that's being threatened and challenged by different actors. And so I want to divide my class into three separate parts. The first part is the first obstacle or impediment is this idea that we have almost kind of like a new religion, the religiosity of today, of modernity, is this idea of a development or a progress myth, right? And this is something new. This idea that I'm going to talk about continuous growth, continuous kind of upward mobility, upward trends, in the fact that we have internalized this idea that the only way to live well is to continue to have more, to conquer more, to use more. This is kind of the essence of the progress myth, and it's one of the, I would say, perhaps cultural obstacles or cultural impediments to localization, to community sovereignty. The second one is more, I would say, kind of maybe governmental or economic in terms of a structural impediment, and it's economic globalization, corporate greed, and neocolonialism. Like I said, obviously, when a small scale community comes together to try to use their resources in a sane way, to try to carve out a good living from the landscape, from the bioregion, that can be great. But when a multinational corporation says, we see that you have an enormous amount of lithium or gold or oil or natural gas or whatever resource that might be in demand, and say we need this because the global economy, the global motor of our economic system requires this resource, then this community sovereignty comes under attack, not from like a cultural mindset of wanting to exploit because of the greed that comes from the outside. So I want to take a look at this of how economic globalization, corporate greed, and this neo-colonialist tendency, not necessarily where the United States or Great Britain or France or whatever sends in troops to take over the country politically, but there definitely is a neo-colonialist tendency in resource extraction. And lastly, the last obstacle I want to look at is the idea of a paternalist state. This idea that the only way people and communities, localized communities, can meet their needs is by depending on the state. And I want to say that there's obviously a role for governments to play on all different levels, but this idea that for example, in my community, the only way we can live well is by doing everything that the government asks us. And so looking at this, challenging this idea of a paternalist state that we must depend upon is one of the things that we must overcome for true localization to really take place. So let's go ahead and
Tobias
start.
Roberts, is it okay if I put a
Yeah,
video in chat? It's about how the economy of China is collapsing, so that's going to affect one of those impediments.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
I'd love to. All resources are great. So please put that in there. So I'm going to try and go through these three impediments fairly quickly so we can have some time at the end for you all to critique, share questions, whatever might come up. So the first one, like I said, is not necessarily a structural obstacle or impediment in terms of that there's a big corporation or a strong government trying to take off. I think it's something more internal. It's a mental obstruction. It's a cultural impediment. It's something that has changed in how the vast majority of humanity conceives of what entails a good life. And it's what I would consider, like I said, I think it's the new religiosity. It's something that has been building over the last 100 or 150 years, kind of coinciding with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, with the fossil fuel age, when humanity started to discover this enormous amount of wealth and power and energy that came with the Industrial Revolution. And with that, all of a sudden, all of these barriers, all of these obstacles, all of these limits that were a natural part of humanity, right? Started to overcome, right? Before the Industrial Revolution, before the advent of the fossil fuel age, there was a limit to how much we could do. There was a limit to how much we could exploit, right? There was a limit to how much human beings could want, how much communities could hope to exploit. And it was because we had to depend on our own bodily energy. We had to depend on, that using animals for traction, for plowing. We didn't have this concentrated source of power in the form of fossil fuels. But when we discovered that, something changed. So, and with this change, we started to develop this idea that our needs might be limitless. The sky is the limit. We can have everything we want. We can conquer the world. We can make nature our handmaiden, right? We can manipulate the world and create the world by our own desires, right? And there's always been something in that of, in the past, of kings and queens and monarchs and pharaohs in Egypt. There's always been this tendency. But what happened, I think, in the last 200 years is that we started to universalize this. In the past, the pharaohs, of ancient Egypt could build a massive pyramid so that they could, supposedly live a blessed afterlife. But that was one person of many, and they had to enslave huge amounts of population. Today, with the power of fossil fuels, as it has obviously not equally been shared, but today, almost every person around the world, or the vast majority of humanity, is benefiting from this concentrated source of wealth. And with this power, we've universalized this kind of pharaonic greed, right? Paul Kingsnorth is a great writer he's publishing a book in the next coming months about what he calls the machine mentality, which is kind of this idea of the progress myth. And he says, here's a quote from this upcoming book. He says, "It is possible through human ingenuity." This is how he defines this myth of endless human progress. So this myth of endless human progress says that it is possible through human ingenuity to create a utopia. We have a story that tells us that human beings started as ignorant savages and are moving through a series of progressive steps in which at every point we get cleverer, richer, we get smarter, we develop technologies which allow us to live longer, to learn more. Eventually, that ends with us probably leaving the planet and colonizing the stars, or living forever, or downloading our brains onto silicon chips for immortality. It's kind of a technological rapture that sees time in a linear fashion rather than in a cyclical fashion, which is kind of, what defined most indigenous worldviews and cosmovisions. It sees an endless series of steps, every one of which improves things in the material sense from the one before. So this idea of the progress myth today is this idea of a ladder, of continuous upward improvement. Whereas most indigenous traditions, most place-based peoples had a cyclical view of history, of time, of humanity, right? Where, we grow our food and then something dies and goes back into the natural cycles of fertility of the soil, and our lives are organized around the cyclical pattern. And that cyclicality have been replaced with the idea of continuous onward upward mobility, right? The development progress myth also, one of the things is, not only is it a change in how we understand almost our kind of the spirituality of the human condition, but it also leaves out lots of things, right? So as we climb this ladder of progress, of continuous growth, of having more, we always think about what we're gaining, right? What new technology brings us, what the use of energy brings us. But there's a blind spot in our vision about, what is fueling this growth? What is fueling this progress, right? And whatever is not included in our definition and our measurement of progress is often harmed in its pursuit. The side effects, which another word we use is called externalities, occur in a complex cascade, often distributing harms throughout time and space. So let's take the example of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution started back in the 1960s. It was a series of chemical innovations, by chemical companies, by agro-industrial corporations, where they found that through the use of fossil fuels in laboratory tests, we could start to implement all of the different agrochemicals in farming. So obviously all of the chemical fertilizers, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizers, the NPK fertilizers, all of the pesticides that all of a sudden where farmers used to have to deal with, bugs eating a part of their crop. Now we could spray these chemicals and we could control nature. We could control all of the different aspects of farming, and we could drastically increase the amount of yields by spreading this little dust, this magical dust on our farm fields. And so everybody looked at this, and we saw the positives. We saw a temporary increase in yield, an increase in production, and we saw that this is going to help us climb the ladder of progress. This is the myth of continuous growth, that through our innovation, through our technologies, through the work of our scientists and our chemists and our agricultural engineers, we're going to always have more and more and more production. What happened, of course, is that we didn't think about the downsides, right? So now we have a drastic loss of topsoil, of fertility, to the point that many people are saying we might have 30, 40, 50 years of harvest left before our world is left without topsoil, right? We see an enormous amount of contamination, a rise in cancers, the drastic loss of insects and pollinators because of the enormous amount of chemicals that we're using to grow our food. And we don't think about the losses that come with this myth of progress. And that's just one example. There's a great book that I would recommend by an author called Charles C. Mann. It's called The Wizard and the Prophet. And he's a journalist, and he kind of follows lives of two different scientists, two different people. One was William Vogt, and the other is Norman Borlaug. William Vogt was one of the first kind of environmentalists back in the 1930s and 40s, who he believed that using more than our planet has to give, the prosperity that came from technological innovation through increased energy use would lead us to ruin. And he was one of the very first voices way back in the 1920s, 1930s, who said, stop, cut back. We have to reduce. We can't continue this path of continuous upward mobility, of continuous economic growth. Otherwise, everyone will lose. And then Norman Borlaug, who Charles Mann calls the wizard, was a scientist who actually he won the Nobel Prize, I think, in chemistry. His research into in the laboratory was kind of what started what's known as the Green Revolution. He was the one that helped determine how plant genetics could start to increase plant yields, how we could begin to develop chemical fertilizers. And his idea was that through scientific research, through innovation, we can wrangle the world in service to our species, to the human species, to produce high yield crops that will save millions of people from starvation. And his kind of mantra was that innovate. Only in that way everyone can win. And so there's this back in the 1920s and 30s, and still today there's this kind of we say choque in Spanish, this clash between mentalities, between those who say that limits are good and necessary, restraint is needs to be a part of the human condition, and then the other side of those who follow this progress myth that say no, let's continue to believe in science and innovation, technology and human ingenuity, and don't worry about externalities, don't worry about all of the negative consequences, because all of the bad things that we're creating today, the future will fix. Future innovation will fix. Don't worry about climate change today. We can continue to burn fossil fuels because pretty soon our scientists are going to find out, different ways to do geoengineering so that we control, how much sunlight enters our atmosphere. That's kind of this hope that's part of the progress myth. I think the problem with that is that if we continue to measure and optimize progress against a very narrow set of metrics, metrics that are focused primarily on economic growth, technology acquisition, increased amounts of resource use, what happens is we do not account for everything on which our existence depends, right? Yes, we need some sorts of economic growth. Technology is something that humans use. Obviously, some sort of resource use needs to be a part of the human condition. But if we only think of that, right? If we don't think about all of the services, environmental services that nature provides, right? If we don't take into account the coherency of communities, the traditions of local cultures, the sense of belonging to place that has kind of been the essence of where human cultures really thrived, then our progress will remain immature and humanity will continue its blind push towards a civilizational cliff edge, right? We continue this path of upward growth until the ladder ends. And then what happens once that ladder ends? This dominant progress narrative is the pervasive idea within our culture that technological innovation, markets, and our institutions of scientific research and education will always and forever enable and promote a general improvement in human life. That is the essence of the progress myth, right? And one of the problems, I think, is that this idea, this myth, this progress myth is still the dominant paradigm in the world of international development. Instead of talking about how to strengthen local communities, in many cases, through accepting tradition, through empowering autonomy, through helping people understand that certain aspects of restraint and limitation are good and necessary. Instead of that, aid money comes in and encourages people a lot of times to do more, to trust in technology, to transfer technologies, to grow the economy at every and all expense. Coming in telling a small community of small scale farmers that your best bet is to sell your farmland to the mining company who wants to come in and work, as an employee in the mining industry for the 10 or 12 years that it operates. This kind of very, very short scale or short-term kind of vision of personal betterment at the expense of the well-being of the community. Our idea of progress needs to mature. We need to take more into account, right? When we do our accounting of what entails goodness, we can't just think of economic growth. We can't just think of increasing resource extraction or increasing access to technology. There might be a place for that in certain areas, but we need to include other elements of what it really means to live better, right? If humanity is to survive and thrive into the distant future, we must transform and elevate the very idea of progress into something that is truly good and worthy of shared pursuit and aspiration. As we understand more about the universe and find ways of changing with our technologies, we must account for the endless ripple of cause and effect beyond our immediate goals. We must think about externalities, right? The cost or benefit caused by an economic actor that is not suffered or enjoyed by that same actor, right? We must think about what are we leaving to future generations if we continue to rely on all of the technologies of the green revolution? If we continue to grow our crops with poisons, if we continue to deplete our topsoils, right? How do we take into account the externalities of what it means to provide human nutrition, which is one of the most basic and fundamental needs of humanity, right? We must factor both the upsides and the downsides that will continue to impact reality long after the technologies of today are gone. This kind of conclusion to this part of the progress myth comes from an organization that I volunteered with called the Consilience Project. It's a think tank essentially that is very critical of this progress myth, and they just recently published a new paper about what is true and authentic progress. And it's about an 80-page paper, a document, really interesting. If anyone's interested, you can look it up on their website, which is called the Consilience Project. And lastly, again, so if the progress myth is this cultural impediment to localization, I would say the opposite of that is small scale, localized communities who self-organize to provide for their own needs is in the best way possible. I think this idea, which is counterintuitive in many cases to what many large scale development projects think about what is true progress. For many times, this idea of small scale localization is an impediment that needs to be overcome. Bring people into the global economic fold. Try to bring people into globalization. That's what a lot of development money is aimed at. And I think, again, my conception of good development is no, it's about empowering localities. When we do that, we empower people to respond to real problems that they feel in their own lives. Efficient that they gain the sovereignty and the empowerment to really come up with ways to respond to the issues that affect their well-being. It also allows us to reduce the vulnerabilities associated with the globalized technopoly in which we live, right? Instead of telling farmers to continue to depend on fertilizers and GMO crops and all of the green revolution technologies and all of the vulnerabilities that come with this. How about we try and help small farmers to understand how can we return to a cyclical form of agriculture where we tend to the stability of the soil, where we restore the resiliency of the ecology where we live. That helps to reduce vulnerabilities in the long term. And lastly, small scale localized communities help to create dignified lifestyles wherein the human being can exert a certain degree of autonomy and agency over their lives. That I think is the essence of good development, that people can gain a sense of autonomy and agency and control over the things that affect our well-being, right? Instead of depending on hoping that the global economy is going to go well and that we're going to be doing well economically as well, how can we take control of the local economy where we live, so that even if like Dr. Lambert said, even if the Chinese economy starts to crumble, that doesn't mean that here in El Salvador, in this tiny mountain community, we're going to be affected, right? That even if things start to go to hell in a handbag around the world, we're going to continue to thrive because we have created a local economy that's dependent on the local resource base that we care for, and that even though there might be some ripple effects, across the globalized economy, we're going to stay resilient enough within the well-being of our place. So that's the first impediment, which I think is the hardest one because it's something that infects all of us in our own minds. All of us have, in a certain sense, kind of given ourselves over to this global economic myth, right? The progress myth. But the second impediment is something that there are responsibilities. There are structures and that are in place that actively, I would say, kind of pursue or try to debilitate communities who try to localize, who try to strengthen themselves, their sense of autonomy. And one of the things is the global economy, this global economic regime that depends on resources from all parts of the world to make it function, to help the wheels keep turning. The greed of multinational corporations that feed, the 1 or the 10% of the global economic elite, and the neo-colonialist policies and tendencies. All of these, are threatening communities around the world. So human consumption, why do we have this greed and this neo-colonialism? Here's a few statistics that I think are important. Human consumption of natural resources around the world is expected to reach a staggering 140 billion tons per year by the year 2050. Now that's everything, right? The consumption of natural resources, whether it be oil, gas, and coal for energy, whether it be silica and lithium for the green energy transition, whether it be copper and steel to fuel our infrastructure, whatever it might be. These resources include minerals, ores, fossil fuels, biomass. Natural resources, also known as natural reserves, are biological, mineral, or aesthetic goods provided by nature without human intervention. Examples include forests, surface and groundwater, fertile land, as well as energy resources, oil, natural gas, geothermal energy contained in rock layers. All of these things are what empower our economy. At the very, a lot of times people think, oh, the economy is powered by technology, by financial markets, by the stock market. In the end, it all comes back to the resources, to real things that exist in nature. And by the year 2060, resources use is expected to grow by 60%. Okay, so we're continuing to grow the economy. We're growing the population, and as more people come into this global economic fold, we need to extract more and more and more and more. And we need to think, where does that stuff come from? Right? It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. All of the things that are growing our global economy come from somewhere. The UN, the United Nations, recently released a document called the Global Resources Outlook for 2024, and its message is clear. As a global society, we are consuming more resources than the Earth can sustainably provide, with demand set to rise further. We're already using more lumber, more trees, more fossil fuels, more ores, more metals than what the Earth can sustainably provide. According to the Global Footprint Network, humanity is using up natural resources such as food, water, land, etc., 1.7 times faster than the planet can regenerate. That means that on average, we're using the resources every year of 1.7 Earths, right? Of course, the problem is we don't have 1.7 Earths. We don't have 1.1. We have one, right? And so now, obviously, that resource use again is not evenly distributed. We talk about the global ecological footprint. In the United States, the global ecological footprint is around 6. So people are the average U.S. citizen is using 6 Earths. Instead of one, whereas in Africa, people are still using half of the earth instead of one, right? So, despite the optimistic rhetoric from places like Silicon Valley that say all we need to do is stop using fossil fuels and start using other resources, the problem is that green technology such as solar panels, electric vehicles, wind turbines, all of these green technologies will not be the miracle solution to reduce the strain of our demand. Rather, it's predicted that a transition to green technologies is likely to place an even greater demand on virgin materials such as lithium, gold, copper, metals, all of the rare earth metals that are powering the technologies, the computers, the cell phones that we use. Again, all of this comes from somewhere, right? And as we need ever more resources, it's generally indigenous populations. It's generally small scale farming communities, people who have tended the resources, who have maintained this ecological biodiversity, right? You see all across the Amazon rainforest right now, there's these uncontacted tribes, people who have decided to avoid civilization altogether because they live and they preserve this lung of our planet, the most biodiverse area in the world, the Amazon rainforest. And now, because there's this growing global demand for lumber, for other resources that come from the Amazon rainforest, these people are being pushed farther and farther into the forest, and there's nowhere left for them to go. And all of the mining of lithium in South America, all of the mining of rare earth metals in China and Africa. Most of this comes in areas where there are still people who have tended to the ecological beauty of places, right? They come, big corporations come in, together with national governments and say, this resource that you have on this mountain is a national priority because it's going to help us grow our economy, or grow our national economy. It's something that's needed by the global economy. So we need to come in and mine this. And even if communities resist, there's this enormous amount of conflict here in Central America, where I live. There are conflicts every day, and a lot of times, leading to assassinations, leading to deaths, leading to the military being sent in, the militarization of areas where communities have said no to mining, to hydroelectric projects, etc. Another aspect, kind of this neo-colonialism, is what's known as land grabbing. In Africa, land grabbing is an enormous problem. Land grabbing refers to large-scale land acquisitions, mainly by private investors, but also by public investors, agribusinesses, and even by national governments around the world that buy farmland or other land that has resources such as mines, or lease it on a long-term basis to produce agricultural commodities and mining commodities. These international investors, as well as the public or semi-public or private sellers, often operate in legal gray areas in no man's land between traditional land right and modern forms of property. In many cases of land grabbing, one could speak of a land reform from above, or the establishment of new colonial relationships imposed by the private sector. Here's a few statistics about land grabbing. Since the year 2000, foreign investors have acquired over 26 million hectares of land around the globe for agriculture. This isn't small farmers in African countries or Latin American countries gaining access to land. In many cases in Africa, it's the Chinese government or large Chinese corporations coming in and buying up land, saying, we know that the Chinese population is growing, that people are going to demand more resources. We don't have a land base in China that can provide for our people. So we're going to buy up land in Africa, in other parts of Asia, so that we can ensure that we have enough production for our people. What happens with the African people? Who cares? The same thing is happening in South America. Lots of European governments have started buying up some of the best farmland in old parts of the Amazon rainforest, ensuring that there might be enough resources for the European population using the land base of a foreign country. Right? In Africa, 42% of these land grabbing deals and over 10 million hectares of land have been acquired. Especially along important rivers in Niger, the Senegal rivers in East Africa. A study of the economic impact of land grabbing on rural livelihood estimates that the total income loss for local communities is $34 billion worldwide, right? So you think about small scale communities who want to empower themselves locally, who want to return or strengthen local traditions, who want to farm in traditional ways, or if there's an indigenous population who still practice hunting and gathering lifestyles, and then all of a sudden the government of your national country says, well, actually you can't do that anymore because now we're selling this land off to a Chinese investor, to a European investor who's going to grow a monocrop of wheat or rice or whatever it might be. This is another obvious neo-colonialist policy that's an enormous structural barrier to communities who want to localize, who want to strengthen their autonomy. Increased demand for raw materials and energy, corporate land grabs to ensure a land base for future crises, and increasing speculation in land as a financial asset combine to extract the most valuable resource for localized livelihoods from place-based peoples, the land itself, right? So even if people, overcome this cultural or mental impediment, which is the idea of the progress myth, and say, no, we want to live well in place, even if that means having less, even if that means accepting restraint and limitations. And even if, we come together as a community to try to protect our forests, to protect our water, to work the soil and the resources in a way that replenishes and regenerates the natural ecosystem that provides for us. Even if we do that, there's all these other structural impediments, whether it be land grabbing, whether it be mining, whether it be hydroelectric developments. So that's the second impediment. Let me see how much time I have. Let me try and finish this last one real quick. The last one is the paternalist state, right? And so this idea that lots of people say, well, if we're going to overcome poverty, right? If we're going to ensure food security for our population, if we're going to ensure that there's enough water for the population, the only people that can do that is the government, right? And there's almost kind of this excuse. Well, we're not doing well in our country because the government's not doing well. Here in El Salvador, we have an enormous issue with water scarcity because of mismanagement. But most people say, well, it's the government's responsibility. We just hope that the government does something. They're the ones that have to protect the aquifers, that have to reforest the landscapes, that have to protect the rivers, whatever it might be. And obviously, I think that national governments have an important role to play. But this mindset of just expecting that the state, that the government is the one that's going to be doing it, is going to have to respond, is one, I would say, naive. And is also kind of skirting responsibility, right? All of us consume, all of us, should assume a sense of responsibility for protecting the resources on which our lives depend. Ivan Illich, who I've quoted in several different classes, who's I'm actually doing a master's degree right now in his thoughts, so I always have him present in my mind. But Ivan Illich, here's a few quotes from some of his books. He was very, very critical of the institutionalization of need. He was very, very critical of professionals and the state and kind of this like administration class of taking over everything, whether it be health, whether it be education, whether it be resources. He believed that small scale communities and individuals had a responsibility. And so he says, the loss of self governance, of community coherence, and localized traditions that create particular responses to the needs of each people in each place has been replaced by a quasi universal homogenization of desire administered by professionals, institutions, and the state. Observations of the sickening effect of programmed environments show that people in them become indolent, impotent, narcissistic, and apolitical. The political process breaks down because people cease to be able to govern themselves and they demand to be managed. And that's the essence right there of Illich's thought. He says that what we need is not necessarily for the state to disappear, but the state that governs best is the one that governs together with people, with communities, with bioregions who have the capacity to govern themselves, right? So, for example, in this small scale community where I live, our community is organized to not allow the national, ANDA is the name of the national kind of like water authority in El Salvador. And we have lots of springs and water. We're at the top of the watershed. And the National Water Authority has tried to come into our community several times under the argument that they're going to make, the public water system more efficient and better. And the community says no. Says, no, we don't need that. We do okay by ourselves. We have traditions about how we collectively manage the small rivers that run through our communities, all of the different springs. About how the community ensures that these vital resources are under community management. And we say, look, in some senses, if the government wants to offer us a grant or offer some money so that we can replace a water pump or do something to fix up our piping, then we'll take that money. But we're not going to give over our water resources to a nationally administered water management. Why? Because we want to govern that resource for ourselves. We do not want to be managed by an institution, by a government, by a professional elite. And Illich was saying that's what we need. In every sphere of human activity, we need people who want individuals and communities, small scale communities, to take up the responsibility of governing themselves, right? And once we do that, the political process can be reimagined, right? And it's not about just kind of saying the government's going to do it for us, the state is going to do it for us, the professionals, the institutions, the NGOs, the development organization, the aid organization. No, they can be partners in this process, but they can only be partners in a community and in a group of individuals who is empowered to govern themselves as much as possible. In most cases, strong and semi-autonomous regions communities cannot coexist with a state which, by definition, needs to impose a sense of legibility on the people, territory, and resources it commands. The state requires obedience to its definition of or its conception of progress and development, which may be in contrast to that which a community considers to be good for itself. One of the problems is that the state is, in almost every case, is wedded to the progress myth, right? And in many cases, because it's wedded to this idea, because it's betrothed or connected to this idea of continuous economic growth, in most cases, the states are also, work hand in hand with the multinational corporations, with the greed of resource extraction. And in many cases, it's not only the multinational corporations, it's them in cohort with the national government who are extremely greedy for the resources that are maintained by local communities. For example, communities that live near the site of a future dam that's going to be flooded, or future mining projects, or areas pegged for mega tourism development. In most cases, these small scale communities are not going to find uh, a socio, a partner, someone to really kind of defend their rights in the state, in the government. What they're going to find is an organization, an institutionalization that goes against, that say, why do you want to continue to live as this localized backwards people? We want to bring you into this modernity of development. And I would say that in many cases, small scale communities, those who look to really empower themselves, to self-govern themselves, need to look at the state and its objectives and its goals with a healthy dose of distrust, right? And then lastly, the state has historically, throughout, if we look at the history of the state, it has been defined by and responded to the interests of urban populations, right? Rural areas, also known as the hinterland, have always been the productive base upon which the state depends for its existence. And I think we need to think of, things have not necessarily changed. There are obviously difference between one government and another. Some governments are going to be more open to the idea of truly supporting local community development and community autonomy. But most states continue to operate in what they historically were, which is a group of wealthy elites responding to the needs of a mostly urban population. People who live in rural areas, people who are productive members of society, are generally exploited by the state. And today we see that through these neo-colonialist policies of a government supporting land grabbing by the Chinese government, by a European government, or a state inviting multinational corporations to open up a mine in some virgin forest that's protected, that has been historically protected by an indigenous population, right? The path to localized sovereign rural livelihoods many times challenges this conception of the state and what it exists what it exists to defend. Just two quick examples. Where I lived in Guatemala, there was an indigenous group called the Ixil people, and they lived in these beautiful, diverse, resilient mountains that their community had lived in and protected for over 2,500 years. And because these mountains were still pristine, because they hadn't been logged, because they hadn't been deforested, there was an enormous amount of water. And the Ixil region is famous for the amount of rivers that it had. Starting about 20 years ago, the Guatemalan government started to realize, because of pressure by the United Nations and other organizations, international organizations, to diversify and try to create renewable sources of energy. And so they said, well, we have all of these resources in our national territory, all of these rivers that could provide an enormous amounts of megawatts and gigawatts of hydroelectric electricity. And so the Guatemalan state, the Guatemalan government, found international investors, mainly this one, really the fourth largest energy corporation based out of Italy, and they sent them into these communities, and the communities said, no, we don't want this, because these are our rivers, this is where we fish, this is where we get water. But the government needed that. They wanted to diversify their energy sector, so they sent in the military. They militarized the area, and essentially they extracted the resource of the river from the local community to provide energy, supposedly clean energy, for people who lived mostly in urban areas, right? Which is where the majority of energy demand comes from. The same thing is happening in El Salvador today. Along our coast, there are all of these thousands and thousands of families who lived as traditional kind of fishermen, small fishing villages, people who would go out in the day and fish and come back in and sell to local markets. And now our government says that we're creating Bitcoin City. And there's this enormous rush to try and develop the entire coast. And so what you see is land prices along the coast have skyrocketed, like 100% increases every month in prices. And in a lot of places, the government is trying to go in they're forcefully extracting land from these small fishing villages to build a new airport, to build mega hotels, to build this idea of what they consider to be the future of economic development, which is located around Bitcoin. So my conclusions on this, so we can finish and have some time for questions. These are the three, I would say, kind of impediments or obstacles to true localization, right? The idea of this mental or cultural obstruct of the myth of progress, the idea of corporate greed in this economic myth of continued economic growth, and then the state, which often exists in cohorts together with this economic myth. Illich says that in a society caught up in the race for the better, limits on change are experienced as a threat. The commitment to the better at any cost makes the good impossible at all costs. And I think that is something that we need to think. And in here in Latin America, we have a movement that arose from indigenous peoples called Buen Vivir, which is also often translated as the good life. But it's kind of this idea of living well instead of living better. Right. And Illich was onto this. He said, if we're always trying for something better, for something more, for something improved, then we lose the ability to think about what really is the essence of the good life, right?